Thank you so much for making the time to be here. Good to be with you. I want to ask you, Congresswoman Escobar, as you are just a little bit more than 1 year in your current job as Congresswoman representing this community, you had a perspective on what it was like in Washington before. You certainly hadn't been out of this conversation in your previous roles, but now you're right in the middle of it. Is it everything you expected?
Well, good morning, Evan. Thank
you
so much. And thanks to everyone who is spending their morning with us. I'm really grateful that El Paso does always turn out. I was not quite sure what to expect. I mean, I had an idea that Washington is broken and that getting anything done is really difficult. There have been some surprises along the way. I never realized how difficult of a job it really is. And it is probably the most challenging job I've ever had and ever will have in my life. There's a lot to try to do. You've got to build relationships. You've got to work with folks that you don't know and sometimes whose values are different from yours. You have to work within a caucus. You have to work within the House itself. And El Paso, as you know, has faced some pretty extraordinary challenges in 2019. And so I don't think that I had the typical freshman year, first year experience.
Right, you couldn't have predicted what would happen over the course of that year, but you surely had a sense of how the border region was viewed in Washington, Congresswoman, right? I'm wondering, does the view of the border that you now encounter on a daily basis square with what you thought it was?
What was really wonderfully surprising to me was the willingness of so many, obviously mostly within my own party, to really have their views of the border evolve. Because, if you'll recall, the wall and the funding for the wall occurred with Democratic votes as well as Republican votes.
Right.
And Democrats and Republicans alike have used the border in some respects as a political prop. We've got to secure the border. That's, a refrain you hear over and over and over again, knowing that politically, there's no end to what border security might mean because it works so well with everyone's base. And so I was expecting to have that same, that the battle about the narrative over the border with members of my own party. And believe me, I'm still having that debate with members of my own party. But I found an incredible willingness by my colleagues to come to El Paso, to learn about El Paso. I've brought, in 2019, almost 20% of Congress to El Paso.
At one point or another has come down, right.
Yeah.
And it's important to see the border, to see this community, to fully understand it. It's one thing to legislate without seeing it, but it's another thing to actually come. Mr. Hunt, Congresswoman Escobar is a Democrat, fact check true. You are a Republican, fact check true. You probably agree with more of the policies coming out of Washington right now than Congresswoman Escobar does. But at the same time, you are an El Paso homer. Your family has been here for generations. You love this community. Do you recognize El Paso in the national conversation?
Okay, is this working? Am I on?
You're on.
Yes.
Go get them.
Well, at one point I've made comments about, that we're essentially we're ignored, and by we, the border, some of the issues that are very important to us were really misunderstood, and we essentially ended up being demagogued, or some of our issues were demagogued with collateral damage to us, but for political purposes on the national. So what's happened in the last year is those issues around immigration, trade, border trade, particularly with Mexico, have been elevated to the national dialogue.
Right.
So it essentially, where we had no platform to kind of define ourselves, we now have a platform, and I'm very happy to see that Veronica's taking advantage of that platform to bring people here that might otherwise have been here before, and to be able to speak out on a national basis.
Mr. Hunt, you know that the being ignored is the same thing as being left alone, right? I mean, there's actually an advantage to being ignored. There are people who believe, and I suspect that over your life as a Republican and as a conservative, you've had this position that less government is better. Government out of our business is better. So being ignored can translate into being left alone, and maybe that's a better thing.
Right. No, Evan, because in this case, being ignored really created a perception around the reality of the border that was not the reality. So, and you didn't have to get that far from the border, even Dallas or Austin or Houston, where you had a different perception than what we would see as the reality.
So the vacuum was necessarily filled by misinformation and misunderstanding
and
of the
that gap
border.
was then used politically actually starting at the state level in some
Right.
of our state races, and
Yeah.
then ultimately in the 2016 presidential election.
So stay with that, Mr. Hunt. How would you define, top line, high level, how would you define the federal government's view of the border today, whether it's El Paso or the entire border region? What do you think the federal government thinks about the border today as we sit here?
And when you speak of the federal government, are you talking about at the very top?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, I asked Congresswoman Escobar about the federal view of the border over the last year. I thought she was going to spend 2 minutes dunking on the president, which she didn't do. So maybe you want to talk about the president, Mr. Hunt. Yes, she
It's
tells me it's coming. Yeah,
It's coming.
yeah. Guess what? I knew before you did. Mr. Hunt, I mean, that's interesting. You know, maybe we need to define our terms. When we talk about the federal view of the border, do we mean an administration or this administration specifically? Do we mean Congress? Do we mean the judiciary? Do we mean some combination of those?
Mm-hmm.
You tell me.
Well, I mean, if you look at it from a presidential standpoint, clearly the 2016 election, the pathway to victory there was to deal with that perception or that gap around trade,
Right.
and the impact of trade, and around immigration and the impact of immigration, and use that to gain the votes necessary to win. And in our view, at least my view, used in a way that was, was dealing with the perception,
Right.
not the reality of the border.
So the 2016 campaign view was a negative rather than positive view.
Absolutely.
Do you think it's as negative today as it was back then? Do you think after 3 years plus
Well,
that it's as
we have
negative as it
put
was?
If you remember, it started with a border adjustment tax, a threat to repeal NAFTA, and then now the creation of USMCA. So hopefully the trade economic issues are behind us, but I do think the immigration issue will be a defining issue. And by immigration, not only comprehensive immigration reform, but just how do we deal with the demands of migrants at our border.
Right.
I see that being the defining issue, or one of the very defining issues.
Yeah, Congresswoman Escobar, Mr. Hunt's correct that the political rhetoric at a moment of campaigning and elections, we hear about the border in maybe different terms than we do in the white space between. We're heading back into a general election presidential race. We're probably going to hear about the border again in 2020. You think it'll be same song, different verse from the last election?
I'm afraid it's going to be much worse. We have seen our community not just used for purposes of demagoguery, but we've seen our community used essentially as a prop, but also we've had a target put on our community's back by multiple high-ranking elected officials all over the country, including our own state, and including obviously the president. There was a cooling by the president of his anti-immigrant rhetoric for a little while after the attack that occurred here on August 3rd, but we've seen it ramp up now in his rallies once again. And, we have a real choice in our country about how we're going to address big challenges. And we can either address them with fear as a weapon, or we can address them with eyes wide open and with strategic, thoughtful public policy. The president chooses not to use thoughtful public policy, but instead chooses to use fear. And it's worked for him in the past. It works. It's incredibly successful for him. And he preys on people's deepest, darkest fears and their concerns about the future, and he uses immigrants as a tool to further divide us. And because it has been such a successful strategy for him politically, we can see him using it again. And indeed, he started the night of his State of the Union address.
I want to ask you, is there a disconnect, Congresswoman, between the rhetoric of a political campaign? I mean, everything you're saying stipulated. I think Mr. Hunt would agree that this has been largely the environment that we've all witnessed with our own eyes. But does the policy piece of this connect to the rhetoric? In other words, how much of this is just the kind of talk, however irresponsible it might be, during a campaign season, and how much of it is actually that talk translating into policy?
It absolutely. So the Department of Homeland Security, which was already, in many respects, just one of the most heavily funded agencies over a short period of time that we have in the federal government, and an agency that already in many ways was broken because it had grown so large and had
Yep.
had such little oversight and accountability for so long. It's now not just broken, it is completely shattered. Our asylum system has been also completely shattered. Our role in the world as having, the higher moral authority about human rights, that's gone. All because of the way that rhetoric has been translated into public policy. And we have a white nationalist in the White House who is driving immigration public policy. That's where we are.
Mr. Hunt, would you like to retweet that, or do you have a different point of view?
So I think it's.
It was all going so well there until that last part. Yeah.
Yes, so I think that the president is a byproduct of an environment that has really become hyper partisan.
Do you think he's a symptom but not a cause?
Yes, yes. I mean, he would not be where he is without the environment that was created before that, and that's an environment that a particular party, without any support from
Right.
another party, can pass major legislation. We saw that in 2009 in the Affordable Care Act. We saw it with the Democrats. We saw it in 2017 with the Tax Reform Act that was totally Republican votes. The Republicans spent since 2009 trying to repeal the Affordable Care. If the Democrats win the House and the Senate and the presidency this year, I'm sure that they'll spend a bit of time trying to repeal the 2017. That's not the way to govern. We have too many
Right.
complex problems that can only be solved in an enduring way with bipartisan legislation.
I want to ask you about some of this policy stuff, but something you said struck me, that you thought that the president was a byproduct of an environment. So my memory, Mr. Hunt, is that you were not, at least initially, a supporter of President Trump's. You were not a supporter of candidate Trump in that primary.
That would be true.
That would be true.
And still true.
Still true. So if Senator Cruz or Governor Bush with an exclamation point or whomever it was ended up as the victor in that primary and not candidate Trump, would we be in the same place? Would they not also be symptoms, not causes? I mean, I guess I'm asking you, does it matter? If based on what you're saying, anybody who won the nomination and was elected president would have fallen victim to the same thing?
Does leadership matter? I mean, in a decision, or could you lead the country in a different direction? And my answer would, I think leadership can matter. And so if you
Somebody else might have made a different choice.
might have made a different
Right.
choice.
Yeah. Mr. Hunt, immigration is often, and then the related issues of border security, the wall, remain in Mexico, which has come back on our radar screens again as a significant issue. All that bucket of issues. That is where we typically go first when we talk about the border. That's not, and the region. It's not where we should only go, but that's typically where we go first. Is that the right emphasis? Are we thinking about those issues correctly as sort of top of the agenda or first of mind?
I think immigration is extremely important, but you shouldn't just think of the border. I mean, we just happen to be at the meeting place, but this is really an international issue. I mean, if you live in a less developed country, whether you're a highly trained professional or a day laborer, the single thing you can do for yourself or your family is to move to a developed country. And so it's not only the United States, it's Europe, it's any developed country today has challenges around people wanting to self-select into their.
But because this is the point at which that conversation kind of begins, physically begins,
right.
It's understandable that we would be at least thinking about that issue as a priority for a conversation. Congresswoman Escobar, I took Dr. Wilson, as I said, very seriously when she said, just remember, when you think about the border, there is more to the conversation than immigration. There's a lot of other topics that are relevant. We do polling, I think with the University of Texas quarterly. We just had a set of poll results come out this week, and we asked, as we have asked every quarter for 11 years, what are the issues most important to Texas? 31% of respondents said immigration or border security. This is not just people in El Paso, people along the border. Statewide, what is the most important issue to Texas? 31% said immigration or border security, 3 times the next issue on the list, which we'll get to, which was health care. Clearly, the public in the state of Texas, not just along the border, but every place, believes, as Mr. Hunt said, this is important.
And I hope that those poll numbers reflect a population and respondents who are dissatisfied with the status quo. And really, there should be no differences among any American about the status quo. The status quo is unacceptable. Now, it may be unacceptable for some for other reasons than why it's unacceptable to me. It's the inhumanity of how the American government is treating migrants, and the complete disregard for U.S. law is part of why it's unacceptable to me. But this is why it's important for us to lead during moments of great challenge.
Right.
I just returned from a really incredible set of conversations this weekend overseas about challenges that we face across the globe. And the perspective that I brought was, you know, if we think mass migration is a challenge today, and it is far more of a challenge in Europe than it is for us, than it ever has been for our country, just wait until the climate crisis reaches you know, a point of no return. We may be at that point already.
Soonish, right? Yeah, right.
And we begin to see severe economic instability, severe food insecurity as a result of the climate crisis.
You think we will then know what a real refugee crisis looks like?
Exactly. And so it is important for us to address this issue, not just in the context of how it impacts our communities, not just in the context of whether, you know, we think there should be comprehensive immigration reform or not, but really there's a larger context here that we have to recognize. And I think El Paso, you asked Mr. Hunt about, you know, El Paso and the border being known for immigration. That is a fact. I mean, believe me, I'm trying to expand the view of the border. We're going to be having an oversight committee field hearing in El Paso on bridge wait times, because it's important to address the economic challenges that we have and the opportunities that we face as a community for the state and for the nation. But the reality is that we're facing a tremendous challenge, and we need to lead. And I am very proud of the way that people in this community have led on that issue.
Mr. Hunt, I heard Congresswoman Escobar say, and I understand why she went there, you know, well, if 31% of the state thinks that immigration and border security combined are the most important issue, I hope they're not satisfied with the status quo. Here are two other poll findings from that same series of polls. We asked Texans, do you believe that Texas admits too many immigrants, too few immigrants, or just the right amount? 38% of Texans, the highest percentage response in that poll, too many immigrants. Only 19% said too few. We also asked about the refugees and the refugee policy. You know, Governor Abbott on January, I think sometime in the middle of the month of January, announced that we would not accept refugees. I think 40 other states, Republican states and Democratic states, had said, yes, we will accept refugees. Governor Abbott was the first governor to say we will not accept refugees. So we asked, should Texas accept more refugees who, by virtue of being refugees, have, of course, passed security clearance? Only 51%, basically the state is split, said that we should accept more refugees. Doesn't sound to me like Texans are necessarily dissatisfied with the status quo, right?
I think if you look on an international basis, as far as foreign-born residents, in other words, residents in the country that were born somewhere else, the U.S. has the highest, not only the highest percentage, it has the highest absolute number. So, I mean, you can't really make an argument that we have not been welcoming to others, because we've welcomed both on a percentage and an absolute basis more than any other country.
So if you
that's
were,
the backdrop.
right.
I think you see that.
Yeah, if you were polled, Mr. Hunt, by the Texas Tribune and the University of Texas and been asked that question, do we as a state accept too many immigrants, too few, or the right number, how would you have responded?
I'd probably be in the middle on that.
You would say about the right number.
Right.
Congresswoman, you would have said too few?
Yes, I would say too few, but and I want to qualify that. The cap that the president has put on refugees and the dropping of the number of refugees that we have accepted is the lowest that it's been historically. And until we address the underlying root causes and use cruelty as public policy, then we're going in the wrong direction.
You know that Congresswoman Escobar, although it's not called out specifically in this poll, we know that for a lot of people who say that we're accepting too many immigrants or that we should not be accepting more refugees, there's a concern about public safety, right? Is there a legitimate conversation to be had about immigration and public safety?
Here's the conversation that I think we should be having as a country, and it's very difficult to have it when the minute that you want to open up that conversation, opponents will immediately say, well, she's for open borders or he's for open borders, trying to basically cut off any decent conversation about how we should address this challenge. But we have to separate our national security threats from a humanitarian challenge. And as a country, we've completely intermingled those. So we treat every single immigrant as a criminal, and they are locked up. We have seen long-term detention increase significantly under this president. We have seen completely inhumane holding conditions in our community and other communities along the U.S.-Mexico border because we have chosen to address every immigrant and see every immigrant as a national security threat. And I have said this over and over, and I will continue to say it. A mom and her baby fleeing violence is not a national security threat. Now, do thousands of moms and babies and dads and children and single adults, do they present a challenge for our country? Yes, they do. But here's what I want to share with you, Evan, and everybody watching. Last year, early on in the first quarter of my first term, I took a congressional delegation trip to the Middle East, and I went to Jordan, I went to Baghdad. When we were in Jordan, we toured what is presumably one of the most dangerous borders in the world, the border with Syria. There was not a wall to be seen. The way that they engaged in border security was through technology funded by the American taxpayer. And we asked that they take us to their processing center, their immigrant processing center, because as you all know, talk about a refugee crisis. When you have 2 million people arriving at your front door, that is a real crisis for a country, especially with limited resources like Jordan. So they took us to a processing center, and they described what they do with immigrants who are not national security threats. They essentially link them up with families and with social services. Jordan, a country with far fewer resources than our own. And so I asked them, and this was at the height of when families were staying in our processing centers for 30 to 60 days in inhumane conditions. I asked them, how long does it take you to process migrants? And they kind of were wringing their hands and, a little bit sheepishly said, well, we're trying to improve on how long it takes. Right now, it takes about 2 hours. That is Jordan.
2 hours.
My friends. That is Jordan.
Right.
And so, but in our country, again, and Woody said it, leadership matters. When you have leaders at the top wanting you to fear some of the most vulnerable human beings on the planet, and that the way that we address that challenge is through cruelty, of course the polls are going to reflect that.
Yeah, let me ask Woody about that. Do you think that there is, Mr. Hunt, a legitimate conversation around public safety here?
On public safety? No. I mean, if you look at all the data on foreign-born, maybe in the sense if you had totally open borders and you're uncontrolled, but for the immigration that we've had to date, you look at the data as far as foreign-born, whether documented or undocumented, and their incarceration rates are below
the numbers just don't square with the perception.
You can always find and demagogue a particular incident of someone that's undocumented that committed a horrendous crime, but if you look at all the data, that's not the picture you get.
Do you accept the characterization of what's happening along the border as a humanitarian crisis?
Well, certainly for those that are engaged and are trapped, but it gets back to the data that you mentioned earlier. To me, there is no consensus that's going to open these borders. We will. So if you want a bipartisan, comprehensive immigration reform, it's going to be a question of what level of self-selection that people that just want to come can come versus criteria that we set. And obviously someone's not coming unless they want to come, but are we going to set the criteria upon which they become members of our society? And do they become citizens? If you go to the Middle East, Veronica quoted the Middle East, go a little farther south to places that have a lot of resource. Dubai, for example, only 15% of their residents are citizens. The other 85% have no rights, no public education, no public health, And once they no longer have a job, they have to leave.
So the status conversation is a legitimate conversation, even if the public safety conversation may be overblown.
Yes.
Yeah. Mr. Hunt, let me move the conversation away from immigration to trade and to the economy. I know that you have banged the drum for some time on the importance of trade and the border economy. USMCA is a good thing or a bad thing for El Paso, as you see it?
I see it as a good thing. I mean, our future is really tied to international trade, and because that's what connects us to world markets and the incomes that go with being tied into a world supply chain.
Right. What was wrong with NAFTA? I thought we had a trade agreement.
I mean,
Mr.
I don't think there was a lot wrong. It didn't pick
Couldn't you
up.
have just told the president that the T in NAFTA stood for Trump? Maybe he would have left it alone.
Yeah, it was largely political, but it didn't pick up the digital world, NAFTA, because that really happened after.
Right.
It didn't pick up energy deregulation in Mexico, although that's kind of being reversed. So there were some reasons to modify. I mean, all of the drama that went along, I think, was unnecessary. But I think we could have made those modifications in a much less confrontational
But
way.
however the road twisted and turned, the destination where we ended up was good, you think?
Well, I think it's no
Right.
worse, and hopefully a small benefit. I don't think it's going to be a remarkable benefit.
Right, right. Congresswoman Escobar, I heard your response to the State of the Union, in which you said, among many other things I want to talk about today, that you believe that the USMCA, as it ended, the process ended, good, but that it was good in part because you and your fellow Democrats made modifications to it that made it good, that you would not have been comfortable with it in the form it was originally proposed. You are, however, prepared to stipulate, it's good for this community.
I completely agree with Woody. I think, we'll see what kind of changes it brings. I don't know that there will be radical changes. I think I think there's an opportunity through the NAD Bank funding that we got in there. I think for many communities with waterways, there's environmental protections that are really good that were put in place by Democrats. I think there's more
Right.
labor protections that were put in by Democrats that are good and strong. I think the best thing that came out of NAFTA is that it's behind, or USMCA or NAFTA 1.8, is that it's behind us, is that now there's stability. There was a lot of angst, a lot of anxiety.
There was definitely uncertainty, wasn't there?
The uncertainty is horrible. I mean, you talk to economic development folks everywhere, business people everywhere. There's nothing worse than the uncertainty. I mean, so there was the anxiety that the president would rip up the North American Free Trade Agreement, and if that were to happen, the chaos that would ensue. So that's been settled.
Yeah. Do you think generally, Congresswoman, that the border economy is good? We know that the national economy right now, I mean, you could argue about aspects of it, and I know you will, whether we're providing an economy that works for everybody, and that's been a conversation that you and others in your party at least have had. But, the Dow is where it is. The Dow's at a record or near record. The unemployment rate nationally is at a low. I mean, there's an argument that can be made that the strength of the economy is as it presents. State economy is pretty good. Is the border economy as good as the state economy and as good as the national economy?
So I would not necessarily agree with you that the economy is good. There are some very good indicators that should be celebrated and that should be looked at as great strengths. But we know that the wealth gap has widened to its greatest level ever. And we're not addressing it. When we try to gloss over any negative, this is one of I think the lessons that I learned as a local elected official. If you ignore the real challenges and the real problems, and you just want to focus on cheerleading what you think is a positive, then those chronic issues just get kicked down the can. We have a national deficit that is out of control. We talk about it frequently in our caucus meetings.
Well, I want to come to the deficit in a second. I think that's a very important point. Yeah.
So, and with the border economy, El Paso has done really, really well. And the credit goes to a huge cross-section of people, folks like Woody and other business community leaders, elected officials, the private and the public sector. And it took a lot of work to do that. I mean, you look at our transportation infrastructure, you look at our healthcare infrastructure, you look at quality of life, you look at downtown. El Paso's made incredible gains. I remember when our unemployment rate was twice the national average. That's in the past.
Long past,
We do face challenges as a community, and I think it's really important for us always to reflect on where we've been successful. And our challenges remain, we're losing some talent, and our wages are not growing at the rate that would make us competitive with some of our regional competitors, even like Albuquerque as an example. So we have to work on that. And
Yep.
we have to come together and identify the sectors and the areas that are opportunities that we have not fully leveraged.
Well, you mentioned wages in particular in your response to the State of the Union. You also mentioned pensions, right? That there's concerns about pensions and wages as components of the economy that we have work still to be done on. Mr. Hunt, how do you feel about the border economy at the moment?
Well, I mean, and when we talk about the border, I'm more knowledgeable here. We did have, I think, a good bit of deferred investment going through the NAFTA negotiations.
Yeah.
I think you'll see that later on the panel, that we're seeing some of those investors return, and hopefully that will be positive as far as employment growth. Our employment growth has slowed down.
Right.
But I'm optimistic that as the supply chain, and particularly as the supply chain risk become more apparent with China, that we're going to see, a resourcing back to North America, and disproportionately that will go to Mexico.
But that'll benefit us.
And that will go, some
Yeah.
of that in Mexico will go to our sister city in Juarez, and that will help drive our regional economy.
Yeah.
So in that sense, that intermediate to longer term trend,
Right.
I'm positive on.
Do you think workforce development in this community, whether it's through the door of a four-year institution like the University of Texas El Paso, or I know Dr. Serrata's here, the community colleges of our state have more than 50% of the higher ed enrollment, so much of the future workforce of the state is coming through or beginning at least at the doors of community colleges? Are we doing okay on that aspect of the economy?
I think we're much more focused on that. I mean, we now have the business and civic community working with and in dialogue with
Right.
K through 12 as well as community college and our regional comprehensive university. So that's a much more engaged effort, because the realization is post-secondary completions of your workforce in terms of college degrees in your workforce drive your income levels, drives your quality of life, drives your competitiveness as a
Right,
region.
the data for all that is right in front of us.
You cannot go up
Right.
the income scale if you don't go up the education scale.
Congresswoman, you teed up the question of deficits as a part of the conversation around the economy, and I'm glad you did, because I wanted to bring that up as well. Mr. Hunt, I'll say, although I'm going to ask this question to Ms. Escobar, I remember a time when conservatives hated deficits, right? And in fact campaigned at election time against ballooning deficits, and in elective office said, we have a huge problem with deficits, and now we have skyrocketing deficits and getting bigger every minute. I noted today that the El Paso Times, in endorsing Senator Cornyn for re-election, in his party's primary, well, don't you, yes, you can make all the faces you want. I realize that. I'm kind of in your house. Do whatever you want, fine. But they also endorse a Democrat in the primary. But endorsing Senator Cornyn in his primary, felt compelled to say, in essentially the however paragraph, his stewardship of the federal budget is troubling when it comes to deficits. I mean, Congresswoman, I think there's an acknowledgement that the deficits are bad for all of us, but we don't seem to be doing much to address it. You want to say a word about that?
I do, and I want to backtrack a little bit, because we have been talking about it as a caucus, how we begin to use. I'll give you an example of where the conversation came up within leadership. Right before we were going to pass HR 3, which is the prescription bill, the Elijah Cummings lower prescription drug bill, intended to give the federal government the ability to negotiate drug costs and to cap drug costs. Really a revolutionary bill in terms of how it would save people money on their drug costs. Really one of the things that I hear frequently over and over again on insulin costs and other things. We talked about where we could use the savings. And one of the conversations was, we probably could use some of this savings. We could either A, further lower the cost of health care, or B, begin to tackle the deficit. So we're having those conversations about how we begin to propose some solutions.
Right.
But I will tell you, I feel like we're having this conversation as though we're dealing with the the Republican Party of the past. There are still traditional Republicans left who I really enjoy having dialogue and discussion and debate with. But the folks in Washington, in the House of Representatives and in the Senate, they are no longer, in my view and in my experience, led by the values of the Republican Party. They are led by their loyalty to one person.
Well, and this is a conversation about the federal view of the border, so I'm focusing on the Republicans there. I mean, Mr. Hunt, you understand, it's the Democrats are talking about reducing deficits and the Republicans are allowing deficits to balloon at the federal level. It's like Freaky Friday, right?
Yes.
What happened?
Well, and deficits, one, are appropriate if you're 2008 or 9 and your economy's upside down.
And you have to
Deficits
stimulate the economy.
Right.
Yeah.
If you're 2020 and your unemployment rate's 3.5%, you don't want to see deficits where they are, because if we do have a circumstance where the economy weakens, we're really not in a position to spend more money. So it's not good economic
You would say that
policy.
the current situation with the deficit is ultimately bad for a community like this one and for a region like
Right.
this one.
Deficits in themselves
Right.
are not necessarily bad. It's a question of level and when you use them. And getting to I do think there's been a change to where at the president level, obviously, he is depending on a different or somewhat different or an expansion of the base that was non-traditional and which really wants government spending and is less concerned about deficits.
Yeah. Congresswoman, I want to ask you about health care. I heard you again in the State of the Union response call out health care specifically as a priority, not just for this community and this region, but for the country. From your party's perspective, it's probably going to be, if not the top issue to be litigated in the fall campaign, but it'll be one of those. In 2018, 26% of residents of El Paso County were uninsured. That is compared to 19% of Texans and 11% of Americans. So El Paso County residents are more than twice as likely to be uninsured as the average American, and 50% more likely to be uninsured than Texans on average. And that's actually the good news. If you move over farther east along the border, Cameron County, Hidalgo County, Starr County, Webb County, the uninsured rates are in the 30s. In fact, 4 of the 5 most uninsured counties in the entire country are along the Texas-Mexico border. El Paso County happens not to be one of those. Right now, a higher percentage of residents of El Paso County are uninsured than have a bachelor's degree. So my question to you is, how do we elevate the healthcare issue for the benefit of this community, and how does the federal view of healthcare at the moment either work for or work against the border region?
Well, and you referenced my State of the Union response, and we purposefully had it at a community clinic because I wanted to drive the point home that we are a community that relies on those community clinics for healthcare in the absence of a national federal healthcare system and in a state that refuses to expand the Affordable Care Act. And a state that is leading the way in trying to dismantle the Affordable Care Act in court, a court case that is supported by the president. When every town hall meeting, and there are times when I'm at grocery stores or running errands, I hear about healthcare every single time I am home. So it is absolutely a pressing issue, and folks are very afraid that the protections for those folks with pre-existing conditions, for example, will be taken away. And let's be clear, that is exactly what the president is trying to do, the president and the Republicans in Congress and in the Senate. That's precisely what they want to do. I have been very frustrated by the national presidential debates in that the focus has been on attacking each other's healthcare plans when the focus, in my view, should be what lies ahead for us in terms of healthcare should the president get reelected.
Well, it is but Congresswoman, it is a
I know,
primary. I mean, they
I
have
know.
to take each other's heads off. Tell me that last night was not just delightful. I mean, the first 10 minutes of that debate last night was they were just wiping blood off of the stage. I mean, it was. Mr. Hunt, you're a Republican and you're a conservative. Whether or not you recognize Republicanism and conservatism in the current federal landscape, what do you think we should do about health care? I suspect that you probably were not the biggest fan in the world of the Affordable Care Act when implemented 10 years ago, right?
Well, mean, I see it in a bigger context, which gets back to Veronica's
Yeah.
comments on income inequality. I mean, the market system that we use to allocate resources, create incentives, has created the largest economy, the world has ever known by any and all measures. Our question is distribution. Health is one of those issues, is how do we allocate resources in a way which deals with income inequality, either directly or indirectly by subsidizing healthcare. How do we do that in a way that doesn't essentially upset our ability to create growth and create wealth? And my argument would be we need to use markets to redistribute, just like we use markets to create
But
wealth.
does that mean the government gets largely out of the business of providing this health care, which I know Congresswoman Escobar believes is not a privilege but a right to everybody? Do you believe the government should play less of a role in being the facilitator of that?
I think government has to intervene in the outcomes of the market
Right.
to try to correct the excesses that are dangerous for our political system.
Yeah.
And to rebalance, but they need to use intervention softly and with markets, and not building a bureaucracy to try to allocate those.
And is that, I believe 20% of El Pasoans are in poverty, the last statistic that I saw. The fourth highest poverty rate among the major communities in this state. The others, by the way, are all also along the border. Is that solution, Mr. Hunt, let the market drive with government filling in where it needs to, the right solution for a community where 1 out of 5 people is in poverty?
I think so, if you've got the right interventions. I mean, if you look at El Paso.
You trust the markets to do the right, to step in and provide the right thing or to do the right thing here?
We have a responsibility to react.
Right.
1950 census, our education level was 20%, post-secondary, college level was 20% above the state
Yep.
of Texas. Our income level was 14% above. By the 2000 census, 50 years later, we're 30% below on both measures. Whose responsibility is that? Was that the federal government's lack, or was that our civic, political, business leadership failure to make the right strategic decisions along the way and not let ourselves get into that?
So you call out your colleagues in this room and elsewhere in the community for not doing what they should be doing along with the government?
Yes.
Yeah. Congresswoman, you will notice if you check IP addresses that I went to your website today, and it was in part because of that blood on the stage debate last night. And I thought to myself, well, they're all fighting about health care, what they think we ought to do. I wonder what Congresswoman Escobar's position on health care is at the moment. And you say very expressly, I believe we need a single-payer health care system. That is the artist formerly known as Medicare for All, is it not?
I am going to support, and let me first say, I believe very strongly that we have to be aspirational and that we have to put our marker down. And I try to do that in bills that I support and in the way that I approach the big challenges. You put down your marker, be as aspirational as possible. But and so in that respect, I'm very much a progressive. But I am a pragmatist as well. And I believe that being able to sustain change takes incremental change. And I would rather make incremental progress year in and year out than have bloody battles over aspirational goals that may not happen right away, and you'd lose a window of opportunity.
So the reason that you don't come out and say I'm for Medicare for all is because you're not.
Well, I'm on the bill.
Medicare for ish. That's the new. that is Congresswoman Escobar's position as you go into the fall campaign. Medicare for ish.
I am for any and all incremental pieces of legislation or appropriations changes or administrative changes that will get us to where everybody in this country is covered.
That's the ultimate goal, right. In the remaining time we have, and then I want to just note we have questions, the capability to encourage you all to join in and ask questions. We have microphones on the two sides. I want to just ask one more thing. On the subject of 2020, Congresswoman Escobar, we have a presidential campaign in full swing. What would be the best outcome, and specifically, who would be the best outcome for this community and this region? Name names. Seriously.
So I have not endorsed.
Right. I'm asking you to do that now.
And I'm not going to endorse.
Right,
not yet. I don't know.
You totally know who you're voting for. Come on.
I actually don't.
Seriously?
Seriously, I'm voting on Friday because I won't be back in El Paso for 2 weeks, and I
So
need
you're
to
going to
pass my
decide
early ballot.
tomorrow, between now and tomorrow?
I am. But let
Can
me.
you give us a hint?
It's a battle between my head and my heart, is what it is. But I will tell you, one of the things that is of great concern to me is I ultimately want a candidate that's going to help heal the country. I ultimately want a candidate that is going to bring us together as much as we possibly can. I want a candidate that is pragmatic and a candidate who will work with everyone. I want a candidate who will have a plan for how to approach the Republicans formerly known as Trumpsters once he's out of office, and a plan for the country. But I also want a candidate for whom the border is important. And I want a candidate who's, going to make commitments about the border, about immigration, about trade, about the economy. And I've had those conversations with 3 candidates, with Elizabeth Warren, with Joe Biden, and Mr. Bloomberg and I have had some conversation, but we keep missing each other's calls.
He was obviously busy preparing for that debate last
Yes.
night. Just kidding. Yeah. So is it down to those 3?
There's another one that I'm considering.
Oh, God.
Can I tell you?
I love a cliffhanger,
No,
but seriously,
I can
come on.
tell you,
Yeah.
I've been very impressed by Amy Klobuchar.
Okay.
So all of my progressive peeps are
Right.
going to be really mad at me.
There's a name missing on that list, Mr. Hunt, and that is Bernie Sanders, who you may know is going to be in El Paso on Saturday. Is he doing a fundraiser at your house?
No.
No. But you seem so liberal today. Comparatively, I thought you were just going to go full-on Bernie bro on me, actually, sitting up here on stage. You don't seem like a Bernie bro to me. How does the 2020 election, Mr. Hunt, in your view, impact this community? And then we're going to go to questions from the audience.
Well, I mean, once again, the leadership at the time, I mean, the issues around immigration and trade, which we hope are behind us, have disproportionately impacted us in an unfavorable way. So to the issue that we have a leader there that takes a different view on trade and particularly on immigration, as far as the rhetoric, because I think the policies are going to be much more difficult for anybody to move too far from a consensus in the country. I think that makes a difference. I mean, it helps deal with this gap between perception and reality that I referred to earlier.
You're going to vote for Mr. Trump?
No.
The El Paso Times is here. Look at Tim Archuleta is here. Look at him directly, actually, when you say, Are you going to vote for the president?
No.
Will you vote? Will you vote for a Democrat, Mr. Hunt?
Yes.
My head will blow up. Really, seriously.
Well,
Really. You know, Senator Rodriguez, we don't normally make news at these events, but that probably walked up to the line. You are going full Bernie bro on me, aren't you?
no.
You're not, okay. We have about 10, 12 minutes left. I want to encourage you to come up and ask questions. We'll go from one side to the other. We'll take as many as time permits. We got to stop at 9:30 so we can give everybody a break before our next panel. Sir.
Hi, so my question is for Representative Escobar. Immigration has been largely absent in the debates as well as international trade. What would be the best way to get the candidates to actually pay attention to these issues that, Mr. Smith said are so much a bigger concern to Texans compared to healthcare, which has been the lead?
That has been, and I think there's 2 different things there. What happens, the conversation during the debates, but the platforms of the nominees, or the candidates, I'm sorry. So the candidates have platforms, and for the most part, their platforms are very good on immigration. The challenge is getting moderators to ask those questions. So
It hasn't come up very much in the debates. That's right, yeah.
I don't blame the candidates for the moderators' complete disregard for what is a really pressing national issue that I think we need a good conversation about. Because again, as I mentioned before, if we think we have seen a refugee situation like none other before, we are really kidding ourselves. This is the beginning of what will be, I think, more global mass migration, including within our hemisphere.
And I do have another question for Mr. Hunt, if I may.
Okay, sure, quick one. Yeah.
Again, with when it comes to the primaries, a lot of the candidates aren't very, let's say, open-minded about free trade. At least not some of the leading ones. What would be, if you had them in the audience, or if they're watching the live stream by any chance, or any other team members, what would you say to them when it comes to, accepting free trade a little more, things that are important in our region?
I think unfortunately, trade confrontation and bilateral trade agreements as opposed to what we've had now is really an attempt to have world trade that on both sides are moving in that direction. I think that's unfortunate. Free trade, if you want to call it that, for the lowest possible friction among all the borders is the way to create world wealth. And not focus on how you distribute it between countries, but how you create a more competitive world. I mean, we've taken so many people, not in this country necessarily, but in other countries, and have put them in the middle class. We're talking about 1 billion people, over the last 10 years. I mean, it's enormous impact of world trade. Even though there's some places that have been hurt, you've got to look at the net benefit to the world and humanity, and it's been huge from free trade.
Sir.
Thank you.
Thank you. I have a question for Ms. Escobar. You talked about wanting somebody that will work across the aisle and work with both sides. Yet I look at your voting history during your first period of time, and everything that the president has supported, you have voted against. What will you do differently when he gets reelected this time to make sure that you work across the aisle with the president?
I see what you did there with the win. That was
The president
heard
has
that.
actually signed some of our legislation into law. Not a whole lot has made it through Senator Mitch McConnell, but that which has been signed into law by the president. So, that demonstrates the fact that on those occasions, obviously, the House, the Senate, the president, myself included as a member of the House, are on the same page. USMCA, I voted for and supported. We'll see what happens in 2020. I would argue our community, our country, we have to really take a long look at what's happened over the last few years and how we have treated our allies, how we have treated the most vulnerable, how we have refused to deal with the pending climate catastrophe that's ahead, and whether we feel that this president has exemplified our values. I think you all know how I feel, and so my hope is that we don't have another.
Right, but of course, I'm going to take the when and I'm going to turn it into a should he be elected. Do you see the opportunity knowing that you've got 4 years, you can either decide I'm going to oppose everything he does because I actually oppose it, or just because I choose to oppose it as a member of the opposing party.
Yeah,
But do you see any benefit in trying to work more closely with the other side?
Wherever there is something good, of course, we would work together. Of course. And that's why I provided USMCA and other pieces of legislation as an example. But where there is an erosion of law, erosion of values, where there are economic decisions being made that are harmful to us, of course I would oppose it.
Got it. Hi.
Hi, so I'm here with, in representation of Canutillo ISD and EPCC with Northwest Early College students as well.
Great.
And I just have, in teaching state and local government, a lot of the sentiment of our students is the idea that in Texas politics, there's not really a role that the youth can play, or even thinking that it will change anything, that Texas politics will change. So in just wondering, what do you think the political climate is within your office, and if you really are willing to work in a bipartisan basis?
Let me let Congresswoman Escobar start, but I want to ask Mr. Hunt a question about this as well. Go ahead.
So the question is whether I want to work in a bipartisan basis, and then the second question is there a place for young people?
Well, it's about the emergence of young people as a
Yeah.
force, and is there really a place for them in the conversation and at the table?
There is absolutely a place for them at the table, and we need them. The decisions that we're making today, in particular about climate change, Almost every young person, I'll tell you, that I come into contact with, or either when I go to speak to students or at town hall meetings when they attend, their number one concern is the climate crisis. We're having a town hall meeting in April focused specifically on the climate crisis, and we're going to be reaching out to the schools. We want young people to attend. The focus of that town hall meeting is what we can each do in our own lives in the absence of any federal changes. What can we do, and what we consume, how we consume it? What are things that are within our own power? And we especially want young people to be a part of it, because they then can help change their household, they can influence their peers. And many times what I have found is especially for young people and for women, they get involved in politics because of an issue, not because they think, I want to be involved in politics, but there's something motivating them. And so we're hoping, not a Democrat or Republican involvement, but civic engagement will come through that conversation.
Mr. Hunt, I want to ask you about this because, unlike Congresswoman Escobar, you and I are old, right? We're sort of we're on the downside of the mountain, right? The fact is that in the 2022 statewide elections in Texas, just around the corner, you think that this election cycle is it. No, just over the rise, we have another set of statewide elections. In 2022, 1 out of every 3 eligible voters in Texas is going to be under the age of 30. That is not to say that the electorate will be that heavily weighted in favor of young people, but eligible voters in 2022, 1 out of every 3 will be under the age of 30. It is no longer a question of whether young people are taking the baton from us, right? I mean, that's it. And so the bucket of issues that we heard referred to, at least at the moment, don't necessarily benefit the party that you are in and the party that is currently in power in Texas. So political change potentially could be driven by demographic change.
Without a doubt.
Right?
In which I have conveyed wherever I have a chance to the leadership on the Republican side in the state, if the Republican Party does not look like the state, it's not sustainable. And that's in terms, and by the Republican Party, elected officials, House, Senate, and statewide elections, if they don't look like in terms of gender and ethnicity, it's not a sustainable
It's not just
party.
the Texas government is whiter than the state and maler than the state, it's also older than the state,
Without
right?
a doubt. So
Yeah.
it's a question of age, but I think as much so gender, because you look at Bernie Sanders, age is
Seriously,
not a-
yeah. As you can tell, Congresswoman Escobar's party is doing really well among the 78 and older crowd, right? Yeah, the Democrats don't exactly have this thing locked up on the youth vote either. I don't know.
That's exactly
all right.
right, yeah.
Good. The question over there. We have time for maybe 1 or possibly 2 more. Ma'am.
Thank you. My name is Cherie Hallberg, and I'm a teacher. First, I'd like to thank Mr. Hunt and Texas Tribune and Congresswoman Escobar. Congresswoman, I would love to see you as a professor at an Ivy League college, as a lady, a Hispanic lady, and I would really love to see you look at that possibility in the future. For all parties concerned, as a teacher, I don't like labels on my pillows, I don't like labels on my blankets, and I sure don't like labels on people. And I think we need to stop with the rhetoric of white, brown, black. How about we just go with humanity and with human beings? That
Question,
being
please.
said,
Yeah, question,
yes,
please.
sir. As a former teacher of U.S. government, if I were to look at the history, I believe the website is USCIS, there's a tremendous amount of information going back decades regarding people who have been rejected to be allowed into the United States. So the question is,
Please.
with this talk of immigration, are we speaking legal immigration, illegal immigration? I consider myself a humanitarian. Can you please assist me in clarification of this?
Congresswoman.
A large percentage of the people arriving at our front door are requesting asylum protection. Not all of them, but a large majority. This administration has chosen to completely obliterate the asylum system as we know it. So individuals who are in the legal asylum system are being sent to a country, not their own, to await their American court hearing. Their hearings are months away. They have no way to have a job in Mexico. They have no family to stay with, and they have become victims of organized crime. We have heard from lawyers and advocates about parents disappearing, people being kidnapped, extorted, women being sexually assaulted. This is what's happening as a result of the Trump administration's assault on immigration. But each one of those individuals applying for legal asylum protection have the legal right to participate in to receive due process, and they have every right to await their hearing in the United States. There are folks who have not requested asylum protection, and they are fleeing their country for reasons that unfortunately aren't covered by the asylum process. But many of the individuals that I've met along the way over the last year, I would say a large percentage of them have a family member who's been in this country working for an American corporation or an American farmer or an American meat packer or an American construction company, and that wife now wants to be reunited with her husband, or that son wants to be reunited with his mother. And I feel that and when they are not requesting asylum protection, they are undocumented immigrants. But I think we have to look ourselves in the mirror as a country. Those migrants that were okay to work in those corporations and help those American corporations make profits, that they now dare want to be reunited with their family. And we say, nope, shut the door. You were good enough to work in building our homes, you were good enough to work in our meatpacking plant, or you were good enough to pick the fruits and vegetables on our fields that feed us, but you're not good enough to be reunited with your family. I think we have a real reckoning. We have to ask ourselves if that's the country we want to be.
Thank you.
All right. Congresswoman, thank you. I apologize to people waiting in line for questions. Unfortunately, we're out of time, and we're trying to keep to the schedule today. We have another panel discussion at 9:45. Please thank Congresswoman Escobar and Mr. Hunt for being with us today. Thank you all for being such a good audience. We will be back in a few minutes with our next program. Thank you.